You now answer me, not at length, but briefly. Did you know about my proclamations?
I knew. How could I not? It was public knowledge.
And yet you did transgress these laws.
Yes, because to me it was not Zeus at all who proclaimed them, nor did Justice, who lives with the gods below, make laws like these for men. Nor did I think your decrees so formidable that you, mere mortal as you are, could override the laws of the gods, unwritten and unshakable. They are not for now and yesterday, but live forever.
There you've got a snatch of the standoff between Greek heroine Antigone standing up for what she believes to be right and the tyrant of her city, Creon.
And if there's one character in ancient Greek myth and story who stands out as a feminist hero and as a civil rights hero, it is Antigone.
The woman of the city of Thebes who insisted on following the demands of religion and burying her brother who had died in a bitter civil war.
And that's even though her uncle Creon, the new ruler, had forbidden it, condemning to death by stoning anyone who tried to do it.
In the modern world, she has become the symbol of human resistance to the oppressive power of the state. The brave, solitary young woman standing up to patriarchy and tyranny and dying for her beliefs.
She's best known from Sophocles' 5th century BCE tragedy Antigone, but versions of her story have been presented in plays with a strong political message, from Nazi-occupied Paris to Nelson Mandela's prison on Robben Island.
And she's been recrafted by a galaxy of modern writers: Seamus Heaney, Ali Smith, Kamala Shamsi.
But we want to ask today if there's something more complicated about Antigone than just the martyr to a noble cause.
This is Instant Classics, the podcast that uncovers the ancient stories still shaping the world today. I'm Mary Beard.
And I'm Charlotte Higgins. Each week we dive into the myths, the dramas, and the characters of the classical world to discover what they still mean to us now. This episode, Antigone, Girl versus Tyrant.
Okay, Charlotte. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we got to start by filling in a bit of backstory about
Yeah.
who Antigone is, where she is, what the big issue about Antigone is. Right? Help us
Yeah,
out.
exactly. Well, I think Antigone is living in Thebes and her uncle is Creon. But I think it's really important to know that she is the daughter of Oedipus. That is Oedipus the king, who married his mother and who put out his eyes and was exiled. That's the subject of another play by Sophocles called Oedipus the King.
And Antigone is actually the child of the incestuous relationship between Oedipus and his mother and wife, Jocasta.
Exactly. So if you fast forward, uh, Antigone's a tiny child at the time of that self-blinding. If you fast forward, what happens is that Antigone's brothers, Polynices and Eteocles, end up inheriting the throne of Thebes. They fall out over who's actually going to be king. They fight a bloody civil war. Eteocles and Polynices kill each other at the end of this war. Polynices was kind of the aggressor. Creon, it's a very incestuous situation. I mean, that metaphorically as well as literally. So Creon, the uncle of Antigone,
That's
Jocasta's brother,
right?
takes over the state.
This is a very inbred family we're dealing with here. Yeah,
totally. And this is where the play kicks off, right? So Polynices and Eteocles, the brothers of Antigone, have killed each other. Polynices having kind of basically been the aggressor and invaded Thebes. Creon is in charge, and in the sort of aftermath of this horrific civil war, Creon decides to refuse a proper burial to Polynices. the brother of Antigone. And there's another character, there's another sibling who's kind of important as well, Ismene, who is Antigone's sister. So that's where the play starts.
And it's a kind of it's a post-Civil War play. Um, if you ever wonder, and we often don't explore the next episode, if you ever wonder what happens after Oedipus has realized that he has married uh, his his mother and has blinded himself and goes into exile, well, things don't settle down back in Thebes in a kind of calm way, predictably. Civil war breaks out between the kids, and then the Uncle Creon um, tries to establish kind of order again. This is a sort of post-Civil War restoration of order, but he does that it partly by kind of saying, "No, we've got this uh, Polynices, the aggressor. Uh, we are not going to allow him even to be buried. That's part of the New Deal." I mean, it sounds kind of bad within modern terminology. I think um, I'm not going to allow this guy to have a proper burial in Greek or particularly Athenian culture. The If you refuse people proper burial, you don't let them make the transition to the underworld. You kind of capture them in a disastrous limbo. So the ruling of saying um, this guy is the wicked one and we're not going to bury him, that has consequences beyond what it would have for us. And Antigone, the sister, sees that, which is, and from there the play, in a sense, kicks off.
Yeah, that in fact, the very, very, very beginning of the play, um, is Antigone deciding that she absolutely must bury her brother, and talking to her sister Ismene about it. Ismene is much less keen on this. So immediately you get this debate between, can we go against the proclamation that's just been laid down by the ruler in order to do this thing that the gods demand, which is the burial of the dead, or should we obey the laws of the state? So just to wind back a bit, I think it's important to say, isn't it, Mary, that the key text here is Sophocles' play. She doesn't, Antigone doesn't appear in a whole host of different Greek or Roman texts. Like the main, that by far the most important version is this play by Sophocles. Though Euripides, another Athenian dramatist, did write a version of this story, but we don't have that text anymore. It's lost. What we do know is that it has a happy ending, and I can tell you, spoiler alert, I can tell you right now that Sophocles' version, the one that we all know, as it were, or that is part of our culture, is not a happy ending.
It's interesting because she doesn't appear much, and she has some bit parts in other plays of Sophocles, particularly focusing on her dad Oedipus. Um, but really, this is where we know Antigone from. So I think it's quite different from many, let's say, of the heroes of the mythical Trojan War, who recur in tragedies, in art, in poetry, in slightly different versions. We know an awful lot about them, as we discovered when we looked, say, at Helen of Troy. When we're telling the story of Antigone, there's one or two other little bits. There's a couple, but not very many, visual representations of her. But essentially, when we talk about Antigone, we're talking about Sophocles' play Antigone and the title role in that.
Yeah, there's just she comes up a little bit in Sophocles' other play about Oedipus called Oedipus at Colonus, which is talking about the end of Oedipus's life. And in that play, she is the child of Oedipus who is stuck by his side and has acted as his guide in exile to her blinded father. And it's kind of interesting that she has this attachment to family She's a loyal family member, and I think that that does resonate through, although actually, these plays, 3 plays that Sophocles wrote that touch on Oedipus and Antigone were all written at completely different times in his career. They were not a trilogy. Anyway,
I think it's quite interesting because the other thing that we've just mentioned is that this all happens in Thebes. This is an Athenian tragedy written in Athens to be performed in Athens, but the setting, the dramatic setting, is the city of Thebes, a bit to the north of Athens, and uh, it's always, I think, worth looking out for when Thebes, that city, makes an appearance in Athenian culture, because it's often used by Athenian writers as a, a kind of place, a foreign place, a slightly foreign place onto which you project some of the debates and the struggles and the controversies of your own city of Athens. It's a it's kind of it's the other, but it's very close to us. And it's so somehow Thebes is not just a real place, it's also a place where the Athenians sort of work out their own problems in the imagination.
and it's where they go to put their weirdest stories in a way, the most twisted and the most incestuous and the most violent. So it has, it's the place, it was founded by this character Cadmus. It's the place where Euripides sets his amazing play, The Bacchae, which is also very violent and unpleasant. It's where the play Oedipus is. It it's a very storied city. In fact, when I wrote my book Greek Myths, Mary, it's the only chat in the complicated way I organized my stories. It's the only section of the book that is organized around place, because there are so many interwoven stories and generational stories about this ruling family, Creon coming up over and over again. The prophet Tiresias tends to put in an appearance in a lot of these plays. So, it's all interwoven in this kind of slightly weird way.
I mean, to put it in kind of perhaps inappropriately modern terms, I mean, Thebes, for the Athenians, Thebes is a safe space for working out horrible problems, for talking about horrible problems, I think. You've already mentioned, Charlotte, how the play opens,
Yes.
which is with the news that Creon, the post-Civil War ruler, has forbidden the burial of Polynices, and it opens with Antigone and her sister Ismene discussing what is to be done, and Ismene being more law-abiding to the new regime and not really wanting to have anything to do with Antigone's plans, which are to break the law that has just been established and to bury Polynices, and so to give him access, to the underworld and the world of the dead, which he wouldn't otherwise get. But a lot happens after that.
And I will run us through that without, I hope, becoming too tedious, but very broadly, not in huge detail. But I would say it's a tremendous opening of a play. Like, if drama is based on people wanting different things, it starts immediately with this sort of sense of conflict. Creon has said one thing, Polynices is not to be buried. Antigone is out there straight away saying Polynices must be buried, and Ismene is saying, "Oh, I don't think that's a very good idea." Anyway, so what happens is that a guard comes to Creon in the next scene and says, "Well, it looks like someone's tried to bury Polynices. There's a scattering of dust is reported over his body." And Creon gets quite cross and says, "You must find the person and bring them to me immediately." Next scene, it's Antigone, surprise, surprise, brought on.
Because they actually catch her in the act, don't they? It's that she's obviously sprinkled Polynices' body with dust. The guards, Creon's military guys, um, uh, they kind of remove the dust, obviously, from the burial. But when the guard, who's a bit chastened by Creon getting so cross with him, goes back, he catches Antigone in the act of putting more dust on the body, as it were, reburying him, going on with the burial.
So the guard comes back with Antigone with him, led on, it captured, as it were, and this is really serious. The culprit is the king's niece, and the punishment for doing this is death by stoning. I mean, so this is it's kind of pretty. Creon does not decide, oh gosh, maybe I was a bit harsh. No, he doubles down. At a certain point, his son appears, right? So we've got another character. Sorry, his son is called Haemon, and it turns out that Haemon and Antigone are betrothed to each other, engaged to be married. So here's another sort of slightly creepily sort of semi-incestuous relationship. And Hyman pleads for clemency. He pleads for Creon to take a more pacific attitude, which he simply doesn't do. So Creon is going down this road. Antigone is effectively being taken off to her doom. Enter the prophet Tiresias.
The Theban prophet Tiresias, who is always, as you say, coming in these plays, right?
He always turns up. He always
Yes.
turns up in a play about Thebes. He says to Creon, "Look, you can't do this." At this point that Antigone's been making throughout the play, really, which is that the gods have one set of laws, and they're just way more important and powerful than any laws a human could make. The gods don't want this to happen. The gods of rights. You need to obey the gods. You need to unravel this. But and Creon, actually, what's really interesting is that Creon immediately folds. At this point, he does not keep on with his fury. But everything is all too late. So basically, everybody's dead. It's sort of, he had relented sufficiently that he decided not to stone Antigone to death publicly, but rather to wall her up in a cave so that she could die over a period of time. And that's an incredibly weird and unpleasant thing to have decided. But for the purposes of this culture, it's kind of slightly less aggressive than stoning someone to death because it allows death to take its course.
It's very hard to know, isn't it, quite how you see this walling up. But what's pretty clear is that you all, in this case and in other cases like it, you wall them up with a bit of food. And at a certain kind of slightly twisted intellectual level, what this means is you haven't actually killed them. They die, but they had food there. So it's you're slightly letting yourself off the hook, and that's what's going to happen to Antigone.
So, Creon is now, oh gosh, I must stop all this and, unravel it and free everybody, get Polynices buried. But it's just too late. A messenger comes on and brings this sort of awful news. Antigone has hanged herself. Haemon, meanwhile, has also gone inside the cave with her and has stabbed himself. And then, shades of Romeo and Juliet, actually. There is a kind of sense of love between those two. And then hearing the news of this, by the way, is Creon's wife, who's called Eurydice. Nothing to do with Orpheus and Eurydice. They just share the name. She hears this news and she goes off stage and she stabs herself to death. So Creon is left with, nobody. His wife is dead. His son is dead. His niece Antigone is dead. It's a sort of really catastrophically dark and tragic ending of this play. Guys, sorry.
No, there's not much good news here. But it's also, I mean, it's the other thing that we just perhaps ought to point out, because quite often when modern productions are put on, what the modern production does is get rid of what actually in the ancient world was a really important bit element in the story, which is the role of the chorus. We have a chorus of old Thebans here, and um, they're often just written out because people don't. The chorus is always quite difficult, I think, for modern productions. But in this case, um, they are perhaps more integrated into the action than they are in quite a lot of plays. That they are participant observers of what's going on, and they have some of the most extraordinary, memorable, and beautiful kind of commentary on this plot that you get anywhere in Greek tragedy. I mean, there is a wonderful wonderful bit about the very nature. How do you understand the cleverness of man, humanity? How do you understand the place of human beings in the world of the gods?
It's so beautiful. So it begins, it's often pulled out and presented on its own. It's known in that case as the Ode to Man, rather annoyingly. But anyway, it's sort of an ode to humanity. And, it's suggesting that humankind is on the one hand, the most extraordinary, inventive, clever, um, resourceful creature you can imagine. On the other hand, so destructive. I mean, it's one of those sort of resonating, truthful, gloriously poetic pieces of writing and just worth lingering on. But it stands on its own. It's hugely influential in the rest of Greek and Roman poetry and through to Western literature in general. But in terms of the play, it's also what one has to see it for us in the context of the play, which is also about this kind of where it's where that kind of the worst and the best that humans can be is in this play.
And I think it's not only modern productions, but I think modern readers, you're following the story, the plot line, and you come to these choral odes, and you think, oh, skip over those quickly, and find out what happens next. Actually, if you do that, you're missing some of the most extraordinary best bits of the play, but you're also missing an idea. They're kind of a, a commentary on the action. And this is one of the clearest places where these, in some ways, apparently, possibly self-standing odes, uh, sung by the chorus, and it would have been sung, um, uh, really do engage with the plot of what's happening.
And there's a wonderful part where Antigone and the chorus are in dialogue, which again, it can be quite tough as a modern reader because these odes tend to be densely poetic. They quite often lapse into, I shouldn't say lapse into, but drift into kind of quite richly textured mythological references that may be obscure to us or require a bit of reading into. But it's so significant in this play and really worth not skipping. I mean, you cannot skip the ode to man, Politodena, as it's known to those with a tiny bit of Greek. Man is full of wonderful things, and one minute he rushes to greatness and the next to terrible acts. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a great bit.
I mean, taking the play as a whole, it's it's very easy to see why it's gone down like it has. I mean, I'm going to confess here that a long time ago, many decades ago, it was the text that I studied, my set text in my A-level Greek, right?
Was this indeed Mary Bird?
It was
Just yesterday.
Yes, just yesterday, and uh, and I've still got actually the Greek text that I used. I think I probably wickedly stole it from my school. Looking back on it, I can see the kind of my little pencil notes and what I've underlined in the text. Uh, Actually, rather like the bit that we read at the very beginning of this episode, and I strongly remember, but I can also see the proof that I was reading this as, a pretty determined 17-year-old woman who saw in this play, leave aside the tragic ending, who saw in this play a kind of a role for a woman who stood up for herself, who wasn't going to be battered by the unjust rule of an unjust tyrant, etc., etc. And it spoke to me. This was iron in the soul kind of time. Uh, when I was doing my A level, Antigone, you know, to say she's a role model would be pushing it a bit because she dies in the end. But this place spoke to me about what women could do.
And of course, and it's, on this level, and I just think it will always be, it will never not be relevant and resonant, because it just stands as a monument to the idea of the individual defying tyranny, the individual standing up against authoritarianism, and it will always be meaningful and resonant. How this story of how individuals behave towards each other, what power does to people, and how the power of one person standing up against tyranny, and all the way through to Tiananmen Square and Tank Man, the guy with his plastic bag standing in front of the tanks. It resonates throughout history, and it will never not be relevant.
In the 20th century, there are really, really major reworkings of it in response to the corruption of power in the 20th century. I mean, there's Ennui and Brecht both do versions of the play in which Creon and his edicts are precious close to fascist dictatorship and fascist rulings. And there's
Absolutely.
a marvelous account, and Mandela himself, Nelson Mandela, tells us about it in his autobiography, that the prisoners on Robben Island under apartheid, they produced their own version of Sophocles' play, clearly with the brutality of apartheid in mind. It's always there, kind of empowering resistance, you know, giving voice to the voiceless, and in a sense, yeah, Antigone does die in the end. I mean, the heroine actually loses her life in the course of standing up to authority, but we know that Creon is ruined too. That Creon has lost, by the end of the play, he's lost everything that might matter to him in his family.
It's very sad. It's a very sad play. There's no getting away from it.
Because I read it first at A level, because I've seen it and read it and taught it, many times since. I mean, I suppose I can also look back though and see the way that my reactions to it have shifted slightly. I think now I don't see it quite so straightforwardly as this is the girl standing up against power. It's become for me a more puzzling play than it looks at first sight. I mean, I think for a start, if you just count up who's the biggest part in this, it isn't Antigone, it's Creon.
Yeah.
Creon has the most lines, by a considerable margin, and if there is a tragic hero in this, it is Creon who, in the end, has lost everything. There is a way in which you can see that people engage with it, and have engaged with it for the centuries, actually, in seeing it as a bit more complicated. I mean, I think one of the most famous analyses was by the German philosopher Hegel, and he thought in many ways it was the perfect tragedy, but he saw it not as a conflict, as we tend to do, between right in the person of Antigone and wrong in the person of Creon, but he saw them, both Creon and Antigone, they were both right in their own way. And so Hegel famously kind of said that this was a play which was a conflict between right and right, not between right and wrong.
And I think that's going to be a great kicking off point for us to discuss this after the break, Mary. And I think that sort of point of Hegel's is going to really help us see that this is an even more interesting play than if it was a mere dichotomy between right and wrong. I think it's got much more to say to us than that.
Hello, lovely listeners. If you're not yet part of our Instant Classics book club, well, now is the perfect time to join, because we are making our way through one of the most exciting works of literature ever. That's Homer's Odyssey.
We would love you to join our book club, which we absolutely adore. So please do join now to give you all the access to our previous episodes and loads of other perks, like being able to join our online community and getting early booking access to our live events.
All details are on our website, instantclassicspod.com. I think that the more you look at this play, it's not just that, Creon's the big part in it. The more you look at it, the harder you find it to sort of massage it, to fit it into the schema that you sort of want it to take. Because, you look at Antigone, and this is clear from the very beginning. Antigone is inflexible, she's egomaniacal, she is thinking only about her own version of what the right thing to do by the gods is. And it's been pointed out several times recently, and I think it's a nice hint of this, which is that when Antigone speaks, she speaks in the first person singular. She's always saying I, me, me. She isn't speaking as part of a community. She's not speaking in the first person plural. She's not saying we. It's always focused only on her.
It's an interesting flip side, isn't it, to the individual standing against, me against the world, as it were. If it's the flip side of that, is this, when does it stop being this brave, solitary figure and start being actually someone who's a little bit, as you say, egomaniacal or inflexible? I mean, one of the interesting things in the play is the relationship between her and her sister, because Ismene sort of maybe stands for, well, depending on how you want to look at it. And I do think this play is everything about depending on how you look at it. Like, you shift it ever so slightly and everything looks different. That's one of the virtues of the play. So her sister Ismene can look like a kind of weak person who just gives in, collaborates with the state, just that. But further into the play, Ismene offers to help Antigone to stand by her, and Antigone at this point absolutely rejects her help, absolutely casts her out. Interesting. And she had the choice there to reject the I and become more of a we, and she dismisses that. The other thing that I was very struck by, again, I mean, I didn't do this for A-level, Mary, but I studied this at university, of course, and had a very similar relationship as you did with this sort of the kind of power of this extraordinary female figure. But she doesn't half talk about death a lot. She is kind of in love with death, and that is, in the kind of in the deep reads of the Greek language and the poetics of what's happening in the lines of the play, there is a huge amount of linguistic play and poetic play around Antigone's closeness to death. It's as if she's on a death wish right from the beginning. Now, that doesn't undermine the fact that she dies for her principle and all that. I mean, all these readings are available. It just kind of complicates it.
And I think that Creon complicates it too, not just because in some ways he's the big part, but that he doesn't start out the monster that he looks like he is when you get to the middle of the play, right? And I think it's very interesting that in the Robin Island production, it was Nelson Mandela who played Creon. And a kind of very strange, curious bit of casting. But Mandela himself says that. Look, he doesn't start out bad. He becomes the rigid tyrant. But at the beginning, he's standing up for the community. They've just had civil war with the brothers Eteocles and Polynices have been literally at each other's throats. We've got Antigone kind of carrying that on by saying, I am going to bury my brother. That's still kind of civil war talk. What Creon is saying, and one of the ways of reading, you're not going to bury him, is that we're leaving that behind and we are now, this is post-Civil War deal. It is not about a warring family. And I think that we tend to, when we talk about Creon, we tend to say that he's standing up for the state. And then you say standing up for the state, that seems, uncomfortable, the authority of the state. If you say, and the Greek is compatible with this, if you say what Creon is doing is standing up for the community against personal interest, then at the beginning, you see him as the man who is bringing the community together, or trying to bring the community together after civil war.
Yeah, after all, it was Polynices who, this is very clear. It was Polynices who created the civil war, who invaded Thebes. And so in that sense, he's trying to sort of bring everything back. Of course, as you say, he becomes much, much more inflexible, and he entrenches. His position becomes very extreme, which is a very, I think, in the way we look at politics in the modern age, that's a very relatable position. We see it a lot. But one thing that I find and have always found a kind of fascinating place to at least speculate is how the original Athenian audience in probably about 442 BCE sitting there. It's quite a hard play to date. But here we have, imagine, all the actors are men and boys. The audience is probably almost entirely men and boys of Athens. How would they have seen this young woman standing up against the authority of the ruler? I mean, what do you think? What's your instinct?
My instinct is to think that they would be a bit puzzled by the stereotypical reaction that this is the heroic woman who faces down male tyranny. I mean, partly because in Athenian 5th century culture, there isn't a role for a heroic woman.
Exactly. The whole concept would have been pretty unavailable, I think.
And you can't help but thinking that in some ways Antigone is monstrous in her claims to virtue and to doing what she thinks is right. And that actually, if you go back to the idea that it's Creon that's the tragic hero, what you see is a man who tries to do the best being led into both tyranny but also tragedy for himself by this young woman who is, out of place in what she's trying to do.
But Mary, she is right. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the play justifies her position. So, I mean, this is why I think it's such a great play, because again, you just shift it a tiny bit on its axis and it all looks different. But this is a play in which Tiresias comes on stage and says, Creon, you've played it wrong. This is wrong. Antigone is Antigone is right. The claims of the gods were greater than the claims that you're making for the state. So how do you pass that in relationship to like the contemporary audience?
I think that was the kind of the problem that Hegel found himself facing, that that it's very hard when you read the text carefully not to see right on both sides. Yes, Antigone is doing what you should do to a Greek body. Um, Creon is himself trying to restore community order after civil war, and I mean, I'm not sure I believe the line that I'm taking here, but I certainly I don't feel it when I read the text. But I think that it's this is woman as a catalyst to destroying men. I mean, Creon is destroyed by this. He's wrong, but he's destroyed. It is the hard lineness of this, in a way, not just unusual, but kind of monstrously heroic woman that pushes him that way. I couldn't claim that that is just what I feel when I read or see Antigone, but when I try to put myself in the position of, um, Athenian men watching this and wondering what how they would have read it, that kind of reading has to be on my agenda, I think.
So interesting. And I think the way this play is constantly throwing back onto us, the audience, the responsibility to situate ourselves in relation to these different kind of entrenched or extreme views is fascinating.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that one of my Cambridge colleagues, Simon Goldhill, has worked on this play a lot, and his line is that in some ways what it does is it pushes the spotlight back onto the audience, onto us, all the people in the play, like the messenger and the guard, who represent the ordinary people in this conflict. That it's raising a question that, look, we have to face now, which is what we've got on stage, what we're seeing in this conflict is the clash of extremisms. We've got two kind of extremisms, and the the really challenging and kind of destabilizing bit is the way the play is making us try to work out how we situate ourselves in relation to extremism. In that sense, there can be no more modern play than Antigone. As we look at a world in which we see these kind of clashes constantly, extremist clashes, and in some ways, the tragedy gets focused back onto us. How can we ever live in a world in which you know Antigone and Creon um, are at each other's throats?
Gosh, I mean, when you speak of it that way, Mary, it does seem like a supremely modern play in the sense that we are living in a world of extremes and extremely entrenched views and people getting more and more entrenched in their positions and apparently sort of insuperable gulfs between us and it all ending kind of badly. But I do think I think what's so interesting about having had this discussion about the complexities, the sort of multivalent part of Antigone, as opposed to the much more straightforward Antigone is good, Creon is bad. Nevertheless, I think it still doesn't undermine the way that it has been reinterpreted. Is that I think that all these things can be true at once. The fact that it was played in Paris in 1944 as um, as an act of resistance against Nazi occupation is unbelievably powerful, and we have to let it be that play for the moments that it's demanded to be that play. When it, I mean, in 1948, Brecht playing it in Switzerland, with the Creon figure very much resembling Hitler. That was incredibly important thing culturally to be doing at that moment, and all of those interpretations I think are absolutely valid, and that's what makes what makes plays like this so exciting, is that they keep speaking to the moment. Um, and I don't know, Mary. There's one recent interpretation that we both know a bit about, to have enjoyed a lot, which is Carmela Shamsi's novel Home Fire, which is, I think, it's a really interesting um, exemplar of how a Greek play and a mythological character can be a text that lives very fully in the present. So she's a British Pakistani novelist. She won the Women's Prize with this novel that was set in 2015 and came out in 2018. It situates the plot of Antigone between a British Muslim family. Anika is kind of Antigone, and Parves is kind of Polynices. And I don't want to say too much about this novel, really, because the plot is unfolded with such sort of grace and intelligence. But there is a Creon character, and he is an MP called Karamat, who becomes Home Secretary. And we discover that Parves has gone off to volunteer in Syria with ISIS, and things unfold. But I think what she does in the novel is do precisely what you described about, all the characters are extreme in their own way, and actually none of them are simply wicked. They're all trying to do their best, and it all goes terribly wrong. And what was unbelievably uncanny about Kamala Shamsi's novel is that when it was published in the UK, it seemed a slightly fantasy idea that Britain would ever have a Muslim Home Secretary, as she wrote in her novel. The year that novel came out, Britain got its first British Home Secretary who was a Muslim, Sajid Javid. And in the novel, there's a sort of recurrent idea about this new Home Secretary being likely to be tougher on extremist jihadis and extremist figures of all kinds, but particularly Muslim extremists. He's going to be tougher on them than any other person would be, in order to sort of counteract any kind of reputation, or and this seemed to happen with Sajid Javid. Maybe, I mean, he famously stripped the British citizenship from a young woman, a girl called Shamima Begum, who had, as a schoolgirl, gone off to volunteer with ISIS. So the whole, in a sense, the plot of the novel became true a couple of years later. Not quite in all its every single aspect, but in certain aspects.
The underplot of Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, it provided a template through which we could see some of those kind of conflicts within British society. And I thought it was extremely moving. And I think I should say that although part of me wants to kind of pipe up and say it's all more complicated when people now put on productions of Antigone in which Antigone is the heroine who stands up against the forces of tyranny. That I want to say, no, it's not quite as simple as that. Tyranny is more complicated than that, right? But in the end, I think you're absolutely right that whatever an old classicist wants to make of this play, it has indelibly become something about the struggles in political culture across the ages, and it's probably the best example, really, of a single work of ancient literature being very much a work in progress. It never stops kind of shifting its meaning. It never stops quite saying, "Are you sure?" Try seeing it this way. And Shams's novel, I think, is brilliant at making that even more intriguing, problematic, difficult, set in a completely different setting.
Yeah. It's a great play. There's no other way of looking at it.
Yeah, go and see it and read it.
As ever, we want to know your thoughts and comments, ideas, questions. And so if you have them, please do send them to us at instantclassicspod@gmail.com or on our social media at instantclassicspod.
Bye. Bye.